based on unconditional love. Or I could add unconditional love and acceptance. That's what they actually said.
Said what?
The great heresy in the church today is a gospel that's based on unconditional love and acceptance.
I think that needs to be expounded on.
Yeah,
because unconditional love, I have a problem with that, but I don't, the acceptance part.
unconditional acceptance is the best.
Yeah, it's the acceptance part, I don't accept any kind of teaching or any kind of immoral behavior.
Yeah.
Not going to go towards, acceptance, just do what you want, that.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't elaborate. That was his statement.
They didn't elaborate in one part of a larger statement.
Yeah, that statement demands elaboration. It's part true, part not.
Okay, what part's true?
Well, I would say that, God, He's given His unconditional love in the sense that, He sent His Son, Jesus, and we didn't earn it. We didn't earn it. We
He
didn't
died
earn
for us
that.
before
He
we
died.
were Christians.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
So from that standpoint, it's like, okay, you guys deserve it, so it was unconditional in that sense that we didn't earn our salvation, okay? But then there are definitely, things that as Christians we need to be doing as part of the sanctification process. It's not just like, okay, you got your ticket to heaven, and now you just go to the brothels and go do whatever you want to do because you punched your ticket to heaven. So that's not a legit gospel.
Any other thoughts on that? I think you're right, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that one.
I know there's a woman that her daughter became a lesbian, and she was horrified that the her lesbian daughter's girlfriend was rejected by her Christian family and refused to come to the wedding. So then she set up this whole business where she was a surrogate mother to homosexuals whose parents refused to attend
I
the
heard
wedding.
about that.
And she's now like a huge thing, and it's like she's spreading the love of Jesus and showing these parents what they really should be like. And it's that to me is really iffy because we do love our children unconditionally. We have unconditional love for our children, but if we allow them to go to hell because we love them so much, we're allowing them to go straight to hell. Then
You really don't love them at all.
it's not love at all.
Well, like part of God's love is the conscience showing us. It's not like you said, like He gives us over to sin, like when there's sin, when He rejects God. Well, there's a reason. There's consequences, earthly consequences, not just God. Like sometimes in the Bible He strikes people down with lightning and stuff. But then sometimes it's just like AIDS or disease and stuff like that you get from committing these sins. And so I feel like the conscience that He gives us and just His law is part of His love, and correcting us is also just showing His love.
Okay, so we're okay with the unconditional love part. Is that what we're saying?
When it's defined, yes.
All right. What about, it sounds like the acceptance part is the part that we have a problem with.
Yes.
Okay. Why is the acceptance part a problem? Just think in terms of salvation, not like sanctification, but just in terms of salvation.
Because we love people no matter what they do. No matter what you do, I'm going to continue to love you. If you're homosexual, I still love you. But I'm not going to accept that as the God's way of life for you. And that is the best way of life.
Okay. All right. So I think I'm just kind of playing around with it a little bit. I think we're all in agreement that God does love us when we don't deserve it. So that's the unconditional love.
We never deserve it.
And we don't earn it, and He just does it. I think the troublesome part is the acceptance piece, because we're in a time now where people want to preach salvation but not deal with sin.
Yeah.
And so I'm always left with the question, saved from what?
Yeah.
What are you getting saved from if you're not going to deal with sin? If you're going to say, it doesn't matter, God doesn't care, why do you need salvation to begin with?
That's right.
Right.
You know? So I think sometimes that trying to, for whatever the motivation, be nice, be popular, whatever, preaching a gospel that doesn't include sin and dealing with the sin problem is not a true gospel. It's a false gospel. And it gives people false hope. And I think, you know, anybody can preach a false gospel. I've even heard people before, maybe not their whole message, but just on one issue, get off track because of some controversial issue, and they'll come down on the wrong side of it. But then they start trying to weave that into the gospel and say, well, you know, God, he's really okay with this now. I know the Bible says he's not, but he's kind of evolved on this issue, and he's just not as, you know, it's kind of like the belief that God ages. And that in the Bible we have the young God.
Mature.
Yeah, we have the young God who's impulsive and black and white thinking, and he's just legalistic and mean. But now we have the elderly God who's grandfatherly, and he just lets everybody get away with everything, and he's just got pockets full of goodies he wants to give to everybody. And somehow or another, that idea is kind of catching on that God, the God that gets preached many times is more of a product of our culture than a product of the scriptures. Now, the one that gets preached more often doesn't line up with scripture, it just lines up with the culture. And it was like, I don't think I talked about it in church, but in Sunday school Sunday, I shared with them an article I'd read of a guy who was celebrating the end of, I guess you could call it biblical Christianity, the influence of biblical Christianity or traditional Christianity in this country, because he thought that version of Christianity, which is the only real version is biblical Christianity, but anyway, was the cause of all of our problems. And so he could not wait for that to go into the dustbin of history so he could be part of a new Christianity. And the new Christianity he was promoting didn't deal with sin. It was just everybody's wonderful, everybody's accepted, everything's lovely, God doesn't care anymore. And it was a Gnostic gospel, which we
It's
talked
no gospel at all.
It's Gnosticism. We talked about that. That in Gnosticism, you don't need salvation. You just need enlightenment. You need to be more spiritual. And if you can be more spiritual, however you define spiritual, that's pretty much it. And so, getting back to our statement, what would Paul say about that statement, by the way? That the problem is unconditional love and acceptance. What do you think he would say about that?
The wages of sin
He would
is
say,
death.
what do you mean?
Yeah, I don't think he would deal with that. I don't think he'd go the way they hope he would go. So, at least in Romans 1 and 2, he's not going that way at all. Because as we've looked at Romans 1, wrapping up Romans 2 tonight, there's no mercy, there's no grace, there's no love, there's just guilt. You are guilty. You are a sinner. Everyone's a sinner. Everyone's guilty. No one gets a pass. And so in chapter 2, if you remember chapter 1, he deals with Gentiles for the most part, and he explains why they're guilty because they've rejected the revelation of God they've been given. And as a result of that, God turns them over to a reprobate mind. And so if you just look at some of the craziness that folks are saying today who are opposed to Christ, they just keep proving Romans 1 true. I mean, at every turn. And they're the very ones who say, the Bible's not true, you need to get rid of that book, and yet they're proving Romans 1 true. So, anyway, if you keep an eye out for that, you'll see it. But let's jump into verse 17. Chapter 2, he focuses on the Jews and why they're guilty. So in verse 17, he's going to start dealing with the question, who are the true Jews? Now keep in mind, the Jewish people, Old Testament Jewish people, were called the people of God. They had the Abrahamic covenant. They had the rite of circumcision. That was the symbol that symbolized their covenant relationship with God. They had the written law of God. So they thought they were in pretty good standing with God, regardless of what they did. It was the fact that they had the knowledge of the law of God was enough. Now, I'm glad we don't have folks that do that today. But back then, they had a problem with people knowing stuff but not doing what they know.
Exactly.
And so that was the problem here that he's going to point out. So in verse 17, he says, you who call yourselves Jews are relying on God's law, and you boast about your special relationship with him. You know what he wants. You know what is right because you have been taught the law. You are convinced that you are a guide for the blind and a light for people who are lost in darkness. You think you can instruct the ignorant and teach children the ways of God, for you are certain that God's law gives you complete knowledge and truth. Well then, if you teach others, why don't you teach yourself? You tell others not to steal, but do you steal? You say it is wrong to commit adultery, but do you commit adultery? You condemn idolatry, but do you use items stolen from pagan temples? You are so proud of knowing the law, but you dishonor God by breaking it. No wonder the scriptures say the Gentiles blaspheme the name of God because of you. Now, how would you like that said about you? How would you like for God to say, the lost folks around you are acting the way they act because of you? That would be pretty rough, especially if you thought you were the spiritual giant, the one that everyone should look to and model. For you, this is verse 28. Well, let's see, I jumped down one, didn't I? Okay, verse 25. The Jewish ceremony of circumcision has value only if you obey God's law. But if you don't obey God's law, you are no better off than an uncircumcised Gentile. And if the Gentiles obey God's law, won't God declare them to be his own people? In fact, uncircumcised Gentiles who keep God's law will condemn you Jews who are circumcised and possess God's law, but don't obey it. For you are not a true Jew just because you were born of Jewish parents or because you've gone through the ceremony of circumcision. No, a true Jew is one whose heart is right with God. And a true circumcision is not merely obeying the letter of the law. Rather, it is a change of heart produced by the Spirit. And a person with a changed heart seeks praise from God, not from people. And so Paul, here in chapters 1 and 2, made the charge that everyone is guilty and needs salvation. And it's because of the sin problem. That sin separates us from God. Not low self-esteem, not a lack of success, not negative thinking. It's sin that separates us from God. So something has to happen to the sin problem in order for us to be reconciled with God. Now that's going to be the message he's going to develop as we go through Romans. He's laid the foundation of what is the problem, and then he's going to gradually move into the fact that we can't fix the problem through human effort. No matter how hard we try. Have you ever tried to, maybe you got feeling guilty about something you were doing, and you said, well, I'm going to be better at that, I'm going to be better at that, I'm going to be better at that, I'm going to be better at that. And then what happens?
Worse at that.
Get worse at that. Or something else starts up. Maybe you get some kind of victory there, but then something over here pops up that you didn't realize what's going to pop up. So you run over there and say, oh, I got to do better at this, I got to do better at this, and then that other thing pops back up. That's the way the law treats us. Because the law, we will not, Paul's going to tell us this. He said, not only will you not obey the law, the fallen human nature will not conform to the law of God. You can't. The human nature is so corrupt, is beyond repair. And because of that, and is in total rebellion against God's law, because of that, there is nothing we can do through human effort to change it. So it's going to take something greater than ourselves to fix this problem. So that's what Paul is trying to put out here for the readers. Now, again, he's writing to Christians, okay? They probably already knew a lot of this, but he wants to make sure, because this, again, is Paul's gospel. And he's laying the foundation of sound doctrine that he believed the church needed to have until he could get there and put some more things in place. So, everyone's guilty, and it's sin that separates us from God and has created the need for salvation or reconciliation with God. And so we're kind of back at this question or this statement that Blaise Pascal made, that everyone has a God-shaped vacuum in them or a God-shaped hole in them. So Paul here has already said, well, the Gentiles do this, trying to fill that void, and they can't. The Jews think they have filled it because they have the law of God or knowledge of the law of God, but they haven't really filled it either. So what to fill the void? See, that void was created by sin. If it weren't for sin, we wouldn't be born into this world fallen. In fact, I used to use that phrase, fallen human nature, at school all the time. And every year when the seniors got ready to graduate, they would ask the seniors, all right, tell us one statement you remember every teacher making in your 4 years here. And every year, when they called my name, they'd say, fallen human nature. I said, you better believe it. Because for a lot of them, they never heard that. They had been told, you're wonderful. Oh, God's missing an angel because you're here. And, you know, and it's just, everything's so sweet. You're the sweetest thing I've ever seen. And then around, you know, to get around 10, 12, somewhere along in there, then they want to start talking to them about getting saved. Well, up until that time, they've never heard they needed to be saved because they're wonderful. They've been told how wonderful and precious they are. And then, you know, you have to throw this conversation up. Well, you know, you need to get saved. Why do I need to get saved? You said I was wonderful. Well, yeah, well, don't you want to go to heaven? Yeah, I want to go to heaven. Okay, say this prayer with me. Oh, okay, I'll say a prayer. And they say a prayer, and they say, okay, good, you're in. They'd never heard of fallen human nature. They didn't realize why they needed to be saved, other than to get a ticket to heaven. But Paul here is laying it out. There's a reason why we need salvation. And so before the solution makes any sense, we've got to see the problem. Okay? So that's why there's no grace here. There's no mercy here. There's no law here. He's just laying it out there. I mean, it's like going to court and whoever's your prosecutor is just running down the list of everything you've ever done. And there's no mercy offered. All right, so Paul rejects the assumption that the Jews had an advantage with God when it came to salvation. In fact, he accused them of being hypocrites and teaching others the law while guilty of the laws they teach. Now, I'm glad we don't do that. That's for other folks that would be hypocrites, because we're 100% consistent. Linda said, yes, amen. Paul reminds the reader that God called the Jews to represent his law as a kingdom of priests to the nations. You remember that? Exodus chapter 19, where he told Moses that you're going to be a kingdom of priests. But their hypocrisy caused them to fail in their role and contributed to the Gentiles blaspheming God. How? Their failure to live consistent with their teaching gave evidence that their message was not true.
Unfortunately, we don't live consistent with our teaching ourselves, and our message is true.
But do the lost people conclude that it's true?
No, they don't conclude that it's true, but they can't see the truth of it until the Spirit of God moves on them, as He at some point has moved on each of us who professes that He is Christ, the Christ.
Right. Yeah, you have to have the Spirit's illumination of the truth.
Yeah.
But we are supposed to be models of that
Yes.
truth. And so if our lives are starkly different from what we profess to believe, does that give credence? Does that cause anybody to look at us and say, I want what you got?
No, they said if that is all,
But
Right.
you know, in one sense, if we emphasize that, this is an extreme thought. If we emphasize that heavily, then we almost make people think that if you do this, you're a saved person. And you can keep the whole law and be lost as a hand. And it is the truth. You can't.
Well, if
And
somebody
you can
asks,
look very saved.
if someone says, I want what you got, that's where you say, well, you need to get saved.
yes, that is a good thing.
Not, you need to keep these rules. I can assure you, nowadays, nobody's going to be attracted to you because you keep a bunch of rules.
No,
In fact, they'll look at you like you're a nut. But if you can demonstrate the spirit of the gospel to people, if you can demonstrate a character that they don't see in other folks, then you're going to begin whetting their appetite to know more about the gospel.
I think that's why it says the word of our testimony brings repentance.
Mm-hmm.
Because our testimony is, I wasn't perfect, but God made me perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I became Christian, and it just, our testimony, our life story of what God has done for us is what actually draws people.
Mm-hmm. All right, so he goes on to say, the symbol of circumcision marked the Jews as God's covenant people. That was the symbol in the Old Testament. Circumcision symbolized a special relationship and a special obligation to represent the ways of God to the nations. The Jews turned it into a point of pride, though, and assumed that the symbol of circumcision and possession of the written law meant they had an advantage with God. Paul insulted their pride by declaring that circumcision means nothing if they did not obey the law, and God preferred a Gentile who obeyed his law over a Jew who did not. Now, I bet that raised some eyebrows. Because if you remember, we said one of the things about them were they tended to be very proud about their heritage and were not bashful about being prejudiced against Gentiles. And so that statement, I'm sure, raised some eyebrows. Well, we get down to the answering the question. So Paul says, who is the true Jew? In verse 29, he says, no, a true Jew is one whose heart is right with God. And true circumcision is not merely obeying the letter of the law. Rather, it is a change of heart produced by the Spirit. And a person with a changed heart seeks praise from God, not from people. The true Jew has nothing to do with ethnicity, physical circumcision, or knowledge of the law. Paul mentioned that God accepts those who obey his law, but, and here's where we're beginning to slip into the gospel, We know that human nature refuses to obey God's law. This is the heart of the problem. The heart of the solution is that Jesus fully obeyed the law of God for us. And when we place our faith in Him, His faithfulness is credited to us. The true Jew is the one whose heart has been changed by the Holy Spirit. So that's the foundation of the problem. Gentiles, guilty. Jews, guilty. And so since we're all guilty, then we've got a problem. And how can we fix it? Well, there's all kinds of religions out there today who promise to be able to fix the problem. It used to be even anti-Christian philosophies would admit something's wrong with people. They just got it wrong on what it was. But we have, I was just wanting to touch on this for the youth because we're going to talk about this Sunday. What are some approaches to trying to fill this void and fix this problem? And it goes to worldviews. So I'm going to just introduce the worldviews we're going to talk about Sunday. One of those is theism. Okay, what are religions that represent theism today? Islam,
Judaism.
Well, no, Judaism would, because theism would mean like it has control of the government too.
No, not theocratic.
That's,
Yeah, just theism, a belief in God. Christianity. That's the three. Okay, so what does each one say is the solution to the problem? Well, we just talked about Judaism. Keep the law.
Islam's the same.
Right. Except for Islam is to keep their law,
Yeah.
which is the 5 pillars.
I want to ask a question,
And the Quran.
because I don't know the answer. I wondered if you can give it to me. I don't know if you know it. Do you know if the Mohammedans practice circumcision? I know they follow many of the Jewish laws.
I don't think they do.
I don't know.
I've never heard it if they do.
Well, I hadn't either, but I don't know, because I know they follow so many of the Jewish laws.
Because I don't know. No, I've never heard, but I don't know. So with Christianity, how do we fix the problem and fill the void?
Faith in God and the acceptance of Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit.
Okay, we'll just say faith in Christ alone. All right, so that's one worldview category. Now, there's 4, and there is no one who's a purist. Okay, we'll talk about this Sunday. We all tend to borrow a little from each, but I'm just giving you just generalities. Okay, all right. Then there's a worldview called naturalism, which is only the natural world exists. That science is the ultimate authority, and if it's true and if it's real, it can be proven. There's empirical evidence for it. So naturalism is by definition atheistic. In fact, if you want to make one of them angry, try to pull God into it. And that will make them very angry. All right, so naturalism historically has recognized that people have a problem. The problem, though, is they try to solve it through humanism, which grew out of naturalism. And humanism just says that, well, in fact, the statement came from the Humanist Manifesto, the second version of that. No God will save us, we must save ourselves. And how do you save yourself? You've heard the term, this is their gospel. Build self-esteem. And if if you can build the self-esteem, they recognize that people were born with a feeling something's wrong with me and insecurity. So how do you fix that? Build up their self-esteem. Now here's the thing about self-esteem. I understand trying to be positive about yourself and stuff like that. I'm not knocking that. But self-esteem's not based on anything. It's just based on me deciding I'm wonderful. But just as I decide I'm wonderful today, tomorrow I may decide I'm not so wonderful. And if I decide that tomorrow, do you see why they're always trying to get this going in schools? I mean, just about the time they think, well, I got Junior thinking he's wonderful now, and he won't try to burn down the school because he loves himself so much. But then the next week, he's trying to kill somebody. Well, Junior, why'd you do that? Well, I just feel so bad about myself. I'm just a loser. Oh, Junior, you had such high self-esteem last week. Come on, we got to work on that self-esteem again and get it built up. And see, that's one reason why what grew out of that was this idea of don't punish people for behavior. Rehabilitate them by telling them how wonderful they are. And so that some of the ideas about parenting, Dr. Spock and some of those guys grew out of this. Don't spank Junior. You just talk to Junior. You know, Junior, you really don't want to stab Mommy and Daddy. Put that butcher knife down. we can find a way to get along here, Junior. And when it's really funny is when they're trying to do that with small kids who don't have the ability to reason in abstract thought. All they know is, I want to stab Mommy right now. And so something physical has to happen to convince them I don't want to do that as bad as I thought.
Think of that Andy Griffith episode with
Perfect.
Barney breaking out the games. I'll take Mr. Potato. I knew you were going to be.
And the kid to make it a metal key so he can get out of the jail cell.
And is that first one theism? Is that monotheism, or would that also include pantheism? Like
No, and what we'll do, we'll put pantheism under spiritualism,
Okay.
which is the next one. Spiritualism is historically what we would normally call New Age.
Yeah, New Age, Buddhist, Hindu.
All your Eastern religions. And nowadays we've had a resurgence of paganism. Now when I say paganism, I don't mean they don't believe in nothing. Paganism is usually a belief in many gods. Not necessarily polytheistic, but more gods of elements. Like there's a god of soil, there's a god of wind, there's a god of this. And so a lot of witchcraft today comes out of paganism. They tend to go back, maybe reach back to Celtic, early Celtic religions and stuff like that. And also, another thing that comes out of that is just personal spirituality. So personal spirituality, they promise that'll fill the void. That'll fix the problem if you'll just become more spiritually minded. The shortcoming of that is, though, is you have to decide what works. And what helps you figure out what works is how you feel about it. So if today I decide I'm going to go over and wash Linda's car, and after I wash Linda's car, I say, boy, I felt pretty good about it. That must have been a spiritual thing.
You didn't do quite well enough, you need to come wash mine.
And then I decide, well, that's a spiritual thing. That felt pretty good. I'm going to do it tomorrow. And I go there tomorrow and wash it again, and I don't have no happy feelings
After the
then.
surgery.
And then I say, oh my goodness, I guess that wasn't a very spiritual thing. Now let me go try this over here and see if that's a spiritual thing for me. It all goes back to something I've talked about here a lot, and I get strange looks when I do. Is existentialism. Existentialism is the belief that there really is no meaning in life. There's nothing that is guaranteed to give everyone meaning and purpose in life. that the only meaning you'll find in life is when you decide something is meaningful for you. So what might be meaningful for a bunch of people Saturday is to go to an Alabama LSU game. Now for me personally, that wouldn't be very meaningful.
Heresy.
It'd be real good this weekend.
Heresy.
I was waiting on the
President's gonna be
comment.
And Trump's gonna be there.
That's right.
I was waiting on the comment.
I'd go to this one. I would go to this game.
But it comes down to where it's spirituality defined by what is meaningful to you. So what is meaningful to me may not be meaningful to you, and therefore I have my spirituality, you have your spirituality, and that's where it can really get weird. But it doesn't matter, because in the big scheme of things, there's only personal spirituality. Okay? I lost Linda on that one. She started going. And then the last one
many big
is postmodernism, which is similar to all this, except for postmodern, there's no absolute truth. So, what can fix the problem? What can fill the void? For a postmodernist, they would appeal to this. If you need some meaning, then you probably need to do something that's kind of spiritual for you, which means you might go to church, you might go volunteer at the dog pound, you might go plant some trees, you might go kiss the dirt or do something. But you find something that is meaningful to you, and since there's no absolute truth, it's just meaningful to you. Now, here's the problem as we're seeing now. For people who buy into postmodernism, it runs its course. And they start off with a lot of optimism that I create my own reality, I create my own world, I create my own truth, I create my own morality, and all of this. And it sounds wonderful to begin with. But then as they begin to run into it, what happens is as the new wears off, a realization begins to settle in that life has no purpose or meaning. And I believe, honestly, that's one of the reasons why so many young people today are killing themselves. Is because they've been told you're a product of chance, there is no God, you just won the lottery, the genetic lottery, and you're here. There's no purpose or meaning in life unless you find some. And they've looked everywhere for purpose and meaning, and they haven't found any. And so they ask the question, what's it worth? Why bother? And it's easy then to commit suicide, to just get out of this mess, because there's no hope. The future's dark. Everything's bleak. And if there is nothing in life but what I create, I'm not creating very much right now, so there'll never be any purpose or meaning to my life. Because the thing is, you can't live this way, is what I'm saying. But this grew out of the conclusion that this, and this are all false. This is a reaction to the rejection of this, and this. Questions? Well, that's more than you wanted to know.
Too many is a lot.